joining us right now, though. He hasn't always been there. He's new to this whole thing. He's a new candidate product in the 2024 race. Vivek Ramaswamy, always good to see you. Second time you've been back. Good to see you.
It's good
How
to
are
be back.
you?
How you been?
Doing well, hanging in there, just watching all these people crowding the primary here. I just got to get, your quick thoughts about the two new additions.
Look, I think that I generally welcome competition. I think competition breeds strength. And I think the debate stage is actually going to be pretty important. I think it allows us to be a better party and a better movement if we're challenged on policy. So I, for my part, am very open to being challenged. I embrace the competition. We've already crossed 3 months in advance the criteria to be on the debate stage, which I think is going to be a crucial milestone in this race. I think all the polling before the debate stages are basically irrelevant. And I think, I'm about where Trump was, a little bit ahead of where Trump was actually in June of 2015. We're a little bit ahead of that today. And I think the dynamics of this race are going to change dramatically starting this fall. I do think that the addition of more professional politicians to this race, if I had to wish, we would actually have more outsiders in the race that could actually bring some fresh perspective that, even on issues like Ukraine or issues in which there's a existing Republican GOP consensus in this race that folks like me are challenging. Frankly, I think it'd be better for our party if we had more additions to the race that were actually challenging the orthodoxies rather than serving up more of the same. But that being said, all else equal, I'll embrace the competition.
Man, there you go. We're talking with Vivek Ramaswamy. If you're not watching the simulcast of the radio program. So, yeah, it is going to, we'll see how many people, I guess, are standing on the stage when it gets there. And it is going to be that contrast of ideas. Now, you've gone, since I've spoken with you, because the last time I talked with you, I know you were just kind of getting the campaign going. Now you've been exploring a lot of these policy issues. You've come out, and we're going to talk about some of those. One of the ones that you came out, not so much a policy issue, I think it was a critique of what was going on in Florida. There was a bill that had been passed, and I'm pulling up my notes on this. This bill, I think it's HB 1185, and it was getting into this distribution of materials onto private property. It was sort of it looked like a public nuisance bill. You characterized it, though, as a hate speech law. And I wanted to kind of get your explanation on why you think it's a law that's about hate speech.
Sure, absolutely. And Dan, I think the thing I said is that Ron DeSantis signed this hate speech law, and I respectfully disagree with it in the hope of having constructive debate about where we are as a party on issues of free speech. So I understand those who supported the bill. It just so happens that I disagree with it. And I think we need to be able to have respectful debate, even though I think some people in that camp took it very personally when I described it as such. So here's how I look at it, is I'm a free speech absolutist. Not every Republican agrees with that, but I am. What does that mean is that the state does not engage in viewpoint discrimination. So this is a law that, yes, does relate to private property, but it prohibits the distribution of certain kinds of leaflets on private property based on what it says on that leaflet. So you can give certain leaflets out on private property, no problem, but there are certain leaflets you can't give out depending on the viewpoints expressed on those leaflets. For me, that is the definition, the litmus test of a hate speech law in effect. But beyond the semantics of it, my general perspective is the right answer to bad speech is not less speech. It is more speech. And I think that is a debate we need to have. I've been having it with the left for a long time. I've gone on NBC, CNBC, and otherwise and pressed on the constraints on speech, making sure that hurtful or hateful or harassing speech, they will say needs to be constrained. I disagree with that. That's not a Republican or Democratic idea. It's a pro-liberty, pro-First Amendment vision. That being said, even if it's a Republican that's signing that into law, I think that we need to be able to elevate and have that debate. And Dan, I think one of the things that I'm going to hopefully call on my other candidates to do better in this race is let's rise above beyond taking everything as a personal affront, especially if we're drawing policy contrasts from one another. The more we're doing that, the better we're going to be as a movement.
Because I was reading this bill, I went, because when I first heard and saw some of the discussion about this bill, and I was reading different editorial takes on it, I thought, okay, I'm going to go read, as I always do. I'm like, I'm going to go read the bill. And at first I thought, is this just a draft of it? Because what it says is it prohibits a person from distributing onto private property any material for the purpose of intimidating or threatening the owner. To me, it sounds like a private property protection issue. I mean, you should be able to determine what you receive on your property.
Well, but that was already the law before this was even passed, Dana, right? We already have hard private property rights in this country. And so one of the ways you understand even the way courts look at enforcing a law is to look at the legislative history, is to actually look at the legislative intent. This was clearly in response to certain kinds of, by the way, I believe heinous forms of speech, harassment against particular religious minorities and religious groups. I condemn that on the substance. But on the principles of free speech, we don't go after that specifically. So this was designed to protect certain kinds of anti-religious speech. And the litmus test I come back to, Dana, is that it used the word litter in one of the provisions of the legislation. Mm-hmm. Litter referring to literature. There are certain forms of literature that you can distribute. Let's say Jehovah's Witness. Let's say there's a different view with respect to a political candidate. People relatively do mail drops, right? But there's certain kinds of literature based on what it says that you can't drop on that private property. So I think functionally what happened was there was an impetus to sort of say that there's certain kinds of heinous speech. And I think there's a reasonable debate to have, by the way. I'm not impugning anybody who disagrees with me on this. I'm just laying out where I stand. Yeah. There's certain kinds of speech that there are many people in this country believe are not in the Overton window, or not in the acceptable pale of what we should freely allow as the expression of certain other viewpoints. I'm actually the extremist on this. I am a free speech absolutist, which I believe the state has no role in regulating what opinions do and don't get expressed when it comes to opinions.
Not to interrupt you, but I guess what are people then, what should they be allowed, what are they not being, what should they be allowed to say in Florida that they're currently not allowed to say? In
another state. So a good litmus test. You're in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are certain leaflets you
Texas, yes.
That's right. and I love it. I think there are certain leaflets you can hand out in Texas that you cannot hand out in Florida. And I think that's the litmus test for a decision that was made. That was why you signed it into law. We've already had private property protections, right? You can't roam around on somebody else's property. Right. That's a familiar notion of what it means to actually have a property right. But there was an added constraint saying that certain forms of literature, especially those which are deemed to be harassing a particular, and it specifically says, based on religious beliefs or otherwise, are now prohibited. I understand. I'm sympathetic to wanting to address bad actors, but in my opinion,
what can they not say?
That would be the way to address. Well, I think that's the question. The state should not be determining that. So what actually? I don't want to give the state.
I don't think the state's telling you that you can't say anything. I think they're sticking up for property owners. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, so what is literature? And I know you've, with due respect, I know you've endorsed DeSantis, and I think that's fine, and we should be able to have this debate. I'll look forward to having it with him. I think it's good for us to debate this. But what is on a piece of paper that someone deems to harass a religious minority is a content-based form of judgment.
I don't think anyone's saying that you can't say that, though. I will add an addendum.
Saying you can't distribute a flyer that says it. So you can distribute a flyer that says vote for Charlie Crist or vote for Ron DeSantis.
Yeah.
But you can't distribute a flyer that says
I don't consider the measure of suppression for speech to be determined by whether or not a homeowner wants it on their property. I guess that's kind of like where I have the difference with you. A quick note on the DeSantis thing, though. I'm always very transparent with my audience, but if I didn't like this bill, I'd be shredding it. I mean, that's what I've always called balls and strikes. I just like to be honest about, and I told you this when you were on the first time.
Yeah, let me see if I can convince you, though.
Okay. Yeah, by all means, persuade me.
Put aside forget which state it is. Let's just go on first principles, right? So why not just a bill that prohibits handing out of leaflets on private property without the owner's consent at all, right? An owner has to say, they stick the mailbox flag up if it means they're open to leaflets, but they put it down because it's not. That smokes out, Dana. And this is why it takes me. We live in complicated times, and this one of my roles in this race is to cut through the BS, mostly on the left.
Right.
But I will cut through the BS wherever I see it. You're not going to disguise something in woke smoke, but you're not going to do it in the language that I like either.
I understand what you're saying, though, and I want to talk to you about a couple of other things to get another policy thing. I understand what you're saying. I just think I still fundamentally disagree that whether or not speech is considered suppressed is measured by whether or not a property owner, like a homeowner or whatever, wants to receive it. I think that's kind of where we disagree on. I think we disagree on that issue. I wanted to ask you one other thing.
Can I do one last thing on that, Dana, just to leave you with it, because I'm a believer in precision. This law does not include commercial spam, right? So many of us get a lot of mail, you and I probably do, that we don't enjoy receiving either. This law does nothing to protect my private property rights there. It is specifically directed at something that could be deemed harassment for a religious group. So I think that let's call a spade a spade. It is engaging in discrimination based on the kind of literature that can be distributed, based on the content and the opinion expressed on that literature. And that's,
I
as a
want to
free
add on
speech
that with the
advocate,
commercial thing. It also talks about. I'm reading some of the language of the law. It also talks about projection onto structures, like projection onto like private property,
based on
things
opinions.
like
Based
that.
on opinion.
And that's kind of, so that would go a little bit beyond the commercial stuff. I wanted to ask too about because you gave an interview and you were asked about military service and trans people serving in the military. And I always go back to the don't ask, don't tell. A lot of veterans have said, I served under don't ask, don't tell, and we didn't have a problem with that being the policy. Oddly enough, that was a Democrat policy under Clinton. But you've said that, and there was some nuance in your answer, so I want to make sure that I highlight that. There was some nuance in your answer, but you were saying
give it to you.
that you would not prohibit the trans people serving in the military. Talk to me a little bit about this. I mean, explain to people what the nuance is, because when people do hear that, they think, okay, so that a lot of people think it's a mental illness. I mean, some people are disqualified from serving for having flat feet. I mean, for goodness sakes, there's a lot of considerations for that. I just wanted to get your explanation on this.
Yeah, sure. So it relates to, I'm a nationalist, Dana. I'm an unapologetic nationalist. And so let me actually rewind and share with you the policy that I unveiled shortly before that prompted the question.
Right.
One of the policies I unveiled is my support for a constitutional amendment in this country that says we would raise the voting age from 18 to 25, but still allow you to vote at 18 if you either serve or else pass the same civics test that an immigrant has to pass in order to become a citizen of this country. So that was the backdrop for this conversation. And I stand by that. That's a bigger conversation about civic duty in this country. Against that backdrop, the question then comes up as a sort of gotcha, which is, oh, well, then would you stop someone who was trans from being able to serve in the military? Because if I'm saying we need more Americans carrying out their civic duty, are you going to ban them from doing it? So here's where I landed on that. I do support a ban on trans persons in combat roles, because that compromises the purpose of the military itself, protecting Americans on American soil. However, if I'm going to stand on the side of principle, if there's a person who, and like you said, we're living in an era, I think don't ask, don't tell. Why does someone need to talk about who they're sexually attracted to when they're in military training? Well,
that's
that
about
ship
the
has long
unity of
sailed.
the fighting force, right?
Right, exactly. So I'm open to having that discussion with you, but let's acknowledge Republicans or Democrats alike, that's now exactly, and has been for a very long time, abandoning the don't ask, don't tell policy, saying somebody can be openly gay or lesbian and talk about who they're attracted to in the open. That's a bridge that already has long been crossed. Against that backdrop, in non-combat roles, and by the way, that applies to combat roles too. But what I'm saying is in administrative or legal functions, or even if somebody wants to be a JAG officer, I will stand on the side of principles as a nationalist who believes in civic duty, that if somebody wants to serve their country in a way that does not create risk or undue cost for other Americans, I won't stand in the way of banning it. However, I am dead set against, I'm probably one of the leading opponents in this country, against the indoctrination of the training sessions and inevitable wokeness in the military.
Some
That's
of the criticism
real
on that has been that you're capitulating to ideology, because they say, well,
I'm
trans
not
is more than
capitulating
just
anybody.
it's ideology.
Yeah, it is. And so Dana, since Woke Inc. in my first book, long before this was popular.
I know. That's why I'm like, what? I wanted to talk to you about this issue.
Well, I've been the leading crusader, and I think it's really easy. And a lot of people, I see this even with the anti-woke stuff that I wrote about in Woke Inc. You'll recite those as slogans because you check a political box. Back when I wrote the book, Republican political consultants were saying nobody knows what woke is. So I believe in precision. Trans is a mental health illness. Absolutely. I think that is why amongst kids, for example, I ban any intervention, chemical castration, genital mutilation.
I don't want to hurry you. I wish we had a longer time in this segment, because it is
the only thing I will say is,
unfortunately not podcast.
Treat it the same way you treat other mental health illnesses in non-combat roles. That's what I would say. And in combat roles, I think we have a reasonable conversation.
You mentioned the civics lesson. And you said that you favor plans to revive civic pride, constitutional amendment to make military service or passing a civics test a requirement to vote at age 18. Is that not a big government solution for a problem that should actually be taught in the home or high schools?
That is not a big government solution, no, because actually the voting age was only ever reduced to 18 in 1971, Dana, in the context of the military draft. And so civic duty being tied to civic privileges, that goes back to our founding. Back then, they said you had to be landowners and taxpayers. But even from much of our history today, I will remind you that men in this country, on pain of criminal penalties, have to register for selective service between age 18 and 25.
I've got 2 of them that did.
Exactly. So what I would say is I would roll back the criminal features of that. That gets big government out. But I would say instead, if you want to vote, which is a civic privilege, then for men and women equally, you have to participate in that actually meaning something, which is either passing the same civics test.
It still
that an
sounds
immigrant
like
has to pass.
federal coercion in a way.
It's not, Dana, and I can explain why.
Well,
So we already
I got
require
about a minute left.
Well,
You know
let me do it
what?
in a
I
minute
would
for
love
you.
to have you back. My
Let me do it
microphone
in a minute.
is yes.
Yeah, I'll do it in 1 minute for you.
Do it
So
in
we-
less
there's
because
a-
I got one last question.
There's a test that we already ask immigrants to pass to become a citizen.
Yes.
What I say is if you want to vote at the age of 18, you can do that. Otherwise, wait till the age of 25. That simple.
One last quick question. I saw back and forth with a friend of mine between you and Dave Rubin. I got to ask you about this. Your press person had accused him of being paid by the DeSantis campaign. Is that what do you know about that? Do you ever, is he paid by the DeSantis campaign?
It was a question I asked Dave, and he said not. So I believe he's not. But that was in response to about 5 consecutive tweets of David. And I was a little disappointed in Dave because he's a friend.
Well, you said that you believe it's not, but
Unsolicited.
your press person accused him of being. So is your press person wrong?
She was actually responding to multiple false accusations that Dave made to me that I was
But
coordinating with the Trump
do you
campaign.
disavow what she said, or do you agree with it?
If it's inaccurate, then it's inaccurate. And Dave, I think, has said it's inaccurate. I
Well,
believe
if it's
him. So he says
inaccurate,
not
you're running
paid.
for president of the United States. We're just talking about, we were just talking about abuse by the executive office against
Dana.
people. You can't be a candidate for president and falsely accuse someone of being paid by a candidate and then just say if it is, if it is or isn't.
She was asking a legitimate question in response to 5 false statements that Dave explicitly made in response to actually my legitimate debate about the hate speech law in Florida. Dave repeatedly said Vivek is coordinating with Trump, paid with Trump, allied with Trump, has a backroom deal with Trump. 100% false. 100% false. So in response to 5 false accusations, it's a mystery why Dave Rubin, an independent commentator, would be taking this up. She asked a legitimate question. Dave answered why, and I'm glad.
I would think he's probably taking it up because you're running for president. Probably as he would do with anybody, just like I would do with anybody.
It reminds me of the left with the Russia collusion hoax with Trump. Not an iota of evidence, but stick to your narrative. Don't let the facts get in the way.
Well, you should have your press person apply that though when talking to voters. Your press person should do the same thing.
We absolutely will ask questions openly and respond to truth when we stand on the side of truth. And it sounds like Dave had a chance to clarify that for himself, just like I did for myself that I'm running.
Vivek, we got to get going. You're always welcome on the show, and I appreciate that you're not afraid of good discussion. I do like that.
Same to you.
Thank you so much. Vivek Ramaswamy, everybody.